Imagine waking up on a single day that will not end for an entire year. The sun rises once, and by the time it finally sets, 12 months of your life have quietly passed you by. That is not science fiction. According to an authentic hadith recorded in Sahih Muslim, that is one of the actual days the world will experience during the exact 40-day period Dajjal walks the earth. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what those 40 days look like, hour by hour, according to what the Prophet Muhammad personally told his companions. Before we go further, I want to ground this properly, because the detail we just covered sounds almost too strange to be real, and I don't want you walking away thinking this is exaggeration or folklore. This entire video is built on one specific heavily authenticated hadith, narrated by a companion named An-Nawwas ibn Sam'an, and recorded in Sahih Muslim, one of the two most rigorously verified hadith collections in existence. It's also cross-referenced in Sunan Abi Dawud, Sunan Ibn Majah, and cited by countless classical scholars across Islamic history. This isn't a fringe narration picked up from an unreliable source. It's one of the most detailed, most carefully preserved descriptions of the end times that we have, and the way this hadith actually begins is almost as unsettling as its content. An-Nawwas ibn Sam'an describes how, one morning the Prophet brought up the topic of Dajjal, and as he spoke, his tone shifted strangely. Sometimes he described the danger as something small and insignificant, and then moments later he described it as something massive and overwhelming. The companions listening became so unsettled by the shifting intensity in his voice that, according to the hadith, they started to feel as though Dajjal might already be somewhere nearby, hiding among a nearby cluster of date palm trees. That's how real this felt to the people sitting in front of him. Later that evening, the Prophet noticed the fear still written across their faces and asked them directly what was wrong. When they explained they were still shaken from the morning's warning, he responded with something worth sitting with for a second. He said that there were actually many other things he feared for them far more than Dajjal himself. It's a small detail, easy to skip past, but it tells you something important right at the start of this whole account, even in a conversation specifically about the most dangerous deceiver humanity will ever face. The Prophet was still redirecting his companions' attention toward their everyday spiritual responsibility, rather than letting fear of one dramatic future event consume all their focus. But then the conversation turned specifically to what we're here for. The Prophet described Dajjal physically first. A young man, according to the hadith, with tightly curled, twisted hair, and one blind, protruding eye. He even compared his appearance directly to a real man the companions actually knew, someone named Abdul Uzza ibn Qatan, giving them a genuine mental reference point rather than an abstract description. If any of you watched our earlier video breaking down the full physical description of Dajjal, this will sound familiar, and it should. This is one of the core hadiths that description was built from. The Prophet then told them Dajjal would emerge somewhere along the route between Syria and Iraq, and that once he appeared, he would spread corruption rapidly in every direction, left and right, moving with incredible speed across the land. And then comes the moment this entire video is centered around. The companions asked him directly, "How long will Dajjal actually remain on the earth?" And the Prophet's answer is the part that should stop you in your tracks. He said, 40 days. But then he immediately clarified something that turns a simple number into something almost incomprehensible. One of those days, he said, will be like a year. Another will be like a month. Another will be like a week. And the remaining days of the 40 will pass normally, just like the days you and I experience right now. Let that actually sink in for a moment, because I don't think it's something you can process quickly. This isn't 40 ordinary days stretched out with some vague sense of dread hanging over them. According to the Prophet, the actual structure of time itself becomes unstable during this period. One single sunrise to sunset cycle will functionally last as long as an entire year normally does. Another day will stretch to the length of a full month, another to the length of a week, and only the remaining 37 days will behave the way days are supposed to behave. Scholars across history have discussed at length what this actually means and how it will physically manifest, and there are a few different explanations worth understanding, because this detail genuinely raises real, reasonable questions. The most literal interpretation, held by a significant number of classical scholars, is that this is describing an actual disruption in the movement of the sun relative to the earth. The day itself, from sunrise to sunset, physically taking that much longer to unfold, as though the sun's normal path across the sky slows down dramatically during those specific days. Under this interpretation, It isn't a metaphor or a spiritual feeling of time dragging on. It's a literal, physical, observable phenomenon that everyone alive during that period would experience directly, watching a sunrise stretch on longer than anyone alive has ever witnessed. There's also a discussion among later scholars and commentators pointing out something scientifically interesting that adds another layer to this. The length of daylight already varies dramatically depending on where you are on Earth. In regions closer to the poles, during certain parts of the year, daylight can stretch on for what feels like an unnaturally long stretch of time compared to equatorial regions. Some commentators have connected this existing, well-documented feature of our planet to the broader idea that wherever Dajjal is operating, or wherever these events are unfolding, the normal experience of day and night might become distorted or extreme in ways connected to this natural variation, rather than something entirely alien to how our world already works. Either way, whether you take it as a wholesale disruption of the sun's movement or something connected to natural planetary variation pushed to an extreme, the core point taught by the Prophet remains the same. Time itself becomes unreliable and unstable during this 40-day window, and that instability was considered important enough that his companions immediately asked a very specific, very practical follow-up question about it. And this is honestly one of my favorite moments in the entire hadith, because it shows you exactly how grounded, how practically minded the companions of the Prophet actually were, even while absorbing something this overwhelming. They didn't ask about fear. They didn't ask for reassurance. They asked a logistics question. They said, "Messenger of Allah, on that day which will be like an entire year, will a single day's worth of prayer be sufficient for us?" In other words, if a single sunrise to sunset cycle now spans 12 months, do we still just pray our normal 5 daily prayers once and consider our obligation fulfilled for that entire stretched out day? And the Prophet's response is remarkably precise for something describing such an extraordinary situation. He said no, 1 day's prayer would not be sufficient. Instead, he instructed them to estimate the proportion of time passing and calculate their prayers accordingly. Meaning, if that single day is functionally equivalent to an entire year, the 5 daily prayers need to be estimated and distributed across that stretched time in a way that mirrors how they'd actually be performed across a normal year, rather than treating the entire distorted day as a single prayer cycle. Scholars have unpacked this instruction extensively, and the general understanding is that believers during this period would essentially need to track time using indicators other than the sun's position, clocks if available, or careful estimation based on how time had behaved up to that point, treating a fixed segment of that elongated day as equivalent to a normal 24-hour cycle, and praying the 5 daily prayers within each of those estimated segments, all the way through until the day finally ended. Think about the sheer discipline embedded in that instruction. The Prophet isn't telling believers to simply endure a frightening, disorienting period passively. He's giving them an actionable, structured method for maintaining their most fundamental religious obligation, even while the basic fabric of time itself is behaving in a way nothing in ordinary human experience has ever prepared them for. That's an extraordinary thing to plan for, 14 centuries in advance, not just warning people that chaos is coming, but handing them a specific method for staying grounded, structured, and obedient to their faith while chaos unfolds around them. Now let's actually walk through what the rest of those 40 days would involve, because the disruption to time is only one part of a much larger picture the hadith paints. Other authentic narrations, including reports preserved in Sunan Ibn Majah, describe how Dajjal moves once he actually emerges, and the comparison used is genuinely vivid. He is described as moving across the earth like a rain cloud driven forward by a powerful wind, meaning his pace isn't gradual or contained to one region. He sweeps across vast distances with startling, almost impossible speed, reaching one place after another far faster than any human traveler realistically could. And what he does once he arrives somewhere is where the real danger of this entire episode becomes clear. According to these narrations, Dajjal will approach a group of people, present his case to them, and call them to follow him. Those who accept him and believe in his claims will apparently be rewarded, at least on the surface.
The sky commanded to send down rain for them.
Crops and vegetation commanded to grow, herds and livestock returning to them larger and healthier than before, an illusion of instant prosperity handed out as a reward for belief in him. But when he moves on to a different community, one that rejects him and refuses to accept his claims, the hadith describes the opposite outcome. That community left in the grip of hardship, their wealth and provisions withering away, drought and scarcity settling over them instead, seemingly as direct punishment for their disbelief in him. I want to pause here, because this is exactly the piece of the story that connects directly back to our earlier video on Dajjal's physical appearance, where we discussed how everything about him is built around deliberate inversion, surface impressions engineered specifically to mislead. On the surface, following him looks like the correct, rewarded choice, and rejecting him looks like the mistake that gets punished. But remember what we covered about his reversed paradise and hell. What looks like reward from Dajjal is never actually good for a person's soul, no matter how convincingly comfortable it appears on the surface. And what looks like suffering under him may not carry the meaning it appears to carry either. This is precisely why the physical markers we discussed earlier, the blind eye, the word kafir written across his forehead, matter so urgently in this exact moment. Someone standing in a community that just received miraculous rain and abundant crops because they followed him would have every emotional and material reason to believe they made the right choice. The only thing capable of cutting through that illusion instantly is recognizing exactly who is standing in front of them, using the specific, unmistakable signs the Prophet described in advance. There's another detail recorded in the hadith literature describing Dajjal passing through wasteland and desolate, barren stretches of land, commanding the ground itself to release its hidden treasures. And according to the narration, the wealth buried beneath that land actually responds, rising up and following him across the surface of the earth like a swarm, gathering behind him as he continues moving forward. Picture that for a moment. A man walking across empty desert, and behind him, trailing along the ground, an entire swarm of gold and treasure, pulled up out of the earth simply because he commanded it. To anyone without prior knowledge, without the specific warnings passed down through these authentic narrations, that would look like the single most convincing miracle a human being could ever witness. And that's exactly the point. It's supposed to look exactly that convincing. The danger was never going to come wrapped in something obviously evil. It was always going to come wrapped in something that looks like undeniable power and provision. There's also a related narration, preserved by the companion Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, describing something Dajjal brings with him that operates on the exact same principle of inversion. What appears to ordinary human eyes as water, and what appears as fire. According to this hadith, Dajjal will present what looks like a flowing river of clear, refreshing water, and what looks like a blazing, dangerous fire, standing side by side. But the instruction given to believers in this narration is deliberately counterintuitive. Whoever encounters this should throw themselves into what looks like the fire, because in reality, it will turn out to be cool, sweet water, while what visually presents itself as safe water will actually turn out to be the destructive fire in disguise. Once again, everything about Dajjal's presentation is constructed to trick the senses, engineered so that trusting your own eyes in the moment becomes the single most dangerous decision you could make. Now, within this same 40-day window, there's one more account worth understanding, because it demonstrates just how far Dajjal's deception is described as extending, even into matters of life and death themselves. Several hadith scholars and commentators, drawing on related narrations about this period, describe an episode where Dajjal encounters a strong, devout young man who publicly recognizes him for exactly what he is and openly challenges him, refusing to be fooled the way the crowds around him have been. In response, Dajjal has the young man killed in front of everyone watching, then brings him back to life, presenting the entire spectacle as undeniable proof of his own divine power. And yet, even after being resurrected, the young man is described as remaining completely unmoved, refusing to change his position, boldly declaring that this display has only strengthened his certainty that Dajjal is exactly the impostor he always understood him to be. The lesson embedded in that account is enormous. It tells you that no display of power, no matter how impossible it looks, no matter how far it seems to cross the line of what a human being should be able to do, is actually evidence of truth. Truth was never meant to be measured by how impressive or supernatural something looks. It's measured by the actual signs the Prophet handed down centuries in advance, signs that remain fixed and reliable no matter how convincing the performance in front of you happens to be. Throughout all 40 of these days, according to the broader hadith literature we've already covered in earlier videos on this channel, there remain two cities Dajjal is described as being completely unable to enter, Makkah and Medina, both guarded specifically by angels stationed at every approach, an unbreakable boundary standing against him no matter how far his influence and destruction spread everywhere else across the globe. And ultimately, once those 40 days conclude, the same hadith narrated by An-Nawwas ibn Sam'an describes the arrival of Isa, peace be upon him, descending at the white minaret on the eastern side of Damascus, resting his hands on the wings of two angels. His very presence in the world described as being so purifying that no disbeliever can remain near him and survive. From there, according to the hadith, Isa pursues Dajjal directly and finally catches up to him at a place called the Gate of Lud, a location near what is present-day Lod, close to Jerusalem. And it's there, at that specific gate, that Dajjal's entire 40-day reign of deception and inverted miracles finally comes to its end. I think what makes this particular hadith so remarkable, more than almost any other narration about the end times, is just how specific and structured it is. This isn't a vague warning telling people simply to be afraid and stay alert. It's a detailed operational account. How long the ordeal lasts, exactly how the days will be distorted, precise instruction on how to keep praying correctly, even while time itself becomes unreliable, a description of exactly how deception will be dressed up to look like reward and blessing, a warning about how even life and death themselves can be manipulated into looking like proof of something false, and finally, a clear, definitive ending, arriving through Isa, peace be upon him, rather than through human effort alone. Every layer of it seems built for one specific purpose, not to frighten people into paralysis, but to make sure that whenever this period actually arrives, believers would have concrete, actionable knowledge sitting in their hands, rather than facing pure, unprepared panic. And that, I think, is really the entire point sitting underneath this hadith. The companions listening to the Prophet that day weren't given a horror story meant to keep them up at night. They were handed a survival manual, one built around a single unshakable idea that no matter how distorted, how disorienting, how impossible the surrounding world becomes, the response is never confusion or despair. It's discipline. Keep estimating your prayers, even when the sun refuses to behave the way it always has. Keep recognizing the signs, even when the miracle in front of you looks completely undeniable. Keep holding on to what was actually taught, rather than what your eyes are telling you to believe in that exact moment. That's the entire lesson tucked inside these 40 strange, distorted days, a reminder that clarity and steadiness are always available, even in the middle of the most disorienting trial this world will ever produce. If you want the fuller picture of everything surrounding this event, go back and watch our earlier videos covering exactly what Dajjal will physically look like, and the mysterious island where the authentic hadith describe him currently being held, chained, waiting for the moment these 40 days finally begin. Each of these stories connects directly into the next, building one complete authentic picture piece by piece. Subscribe if you want to keep following this series, because there's still a great deal more of this account left to uncover.